We are going live. All right. I'm so excited. Woohoo! So welcome to Classic Nina here on the Best Classics Hollywood, Best Classics Ever and Classic Movie Hub channels here on Facebook. I am so excited about my next guest because I get to rejoin with her, and it's been a few years. And her name is April VeVea. She's an expert in all classic Hollywood blondes, I would say, but she's also an expert on Marilyn Monroe, and I'll tell you why in just a moment after I introduce her. She's been on multiple podcasts and radio shows, Turner Classic Movies. She has 2 books out, Publicity, as well as The Last Day in Marilyn Monroe, not Last Day, The Day in the Life of Marilyn Monroe. Do I have that right? Yes, not The Last Day of Marilyn Monroe. That's you and I talking about Marilyn Monroe. 2 books out, and she has a 3rd one coming out, is part 2 of Publicity, which is a coffee table picture book of Jayne Mansfield. So with that, gosh, April, look at all the work you've done over the last few years. Welcome to the show. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Nina. It's always great to see you.
Well, I want to share with the audience, a lot of what we do here on the Best Classics Ever, and particularly this show, is bringing the past present. And one of the things when April and I first met, it was on Twitter. And I was just getting into knowing who Marilyn Monroe was. And I think we're going to shed some light on these classic blondes. They're not exactly as dumb as a lot of people think they are. I was reading about Jayne Mansfield, but on Twitter, I had said something about Marilyn, and it's the typical rumor Marilyn story. And you came back and you said, excuse me, that is not true. And from that point on, I said, this is a person, an expert that really knows what she's talking about. And so that's why it's really fun for me to do these types of shows, because a lot of people have a picture of what old Hollywood or classic Hollywood is, and they don't necessarily know the inner details. So with that said, talk to me about why. I'm going to start with Jayne Mansfield first. Why her? What was the allure to who she was?
You know, Jayne and Marilyn were so connected. They're connected, obviously, through the Fox contract, but people have their images conflated too, that they're both, these voluptuous, dumb blondes. They both represent the 50s. Jayne is a little more of an overblown caricature of it. And I'm saying that out of love. I genuinely love Jayne. And Marilyn's the quintessential 1950s blonde. So I had spent a very long time on Marilyn, and Jayne, of course, kept popping up. And I finally was like, I need to read a book about her. read a book, I believe it was Martha Saxton's book on Jayne, and I just instantly fell in love with her. It was such a different experience than what I had read about Marilyn. They had such different backgrounds, but really connected with Jayne, and then have been focusing on Jayne now for about 5 years, about 5 or 6 years. So it's been great.
Yeah, and you started with Marilyn, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that who you started with? We're going to back up the truck and talk about Marilyn and Jayne in just a few minutes. But really, prior to Marilyn and Jayne, there was Jean Harlow. There's Marilyn Miller, who is I keep hearing the original MM. When you have posts and people that know Marilyn will say MM or something like that. And, now she's being categorized, or has been, as the original, MM. What would you say in terms of Jean Harlow and knowing about her? Because that was one of Marilyn. I don't know if it was one of Jayne's idols, but I certainly know it was one of Marilyn's idols. What's the allure in terms of Jean? What would you say about her for people that want to know more about her?
I would say that Jayne was a complete whirlwind. She basically turns the 1930s upside down. She's, like a little spitfire. She's bawdy, but she's still, super feminine. She's just a spitfire. That's the best way to describe her. And of course, her life ends tragically as well. And I think, again, that kind of exalts you to a completely different level of fame. And, you know, she's just somebody, she was a really kind person in her personal life. She was very laid back. She was a complete 180 from the public image. And she was just somebody, you know, I think she's a really good person for people to focus on because they can really see the start of this, you know, bombshell image that continues really up until today.
Yeah, and you know, I want to talk to you about the starlets when we get further down the road. The starlets of today that might be reminiscent of that old classic Hollywood era. What made you interested in this? You know, I'm a brunette. You're a brunette. What's the fascination with the blondes?
Yeah, no, it's funny because when my Marilyn book was coming out, my mom's like, you got to dye your hair blonde, and I'm like, no, it's not going to work. But you know, I grew up on a pretty steady diet of Shirley Temple and Betty Grable. Mother Wore Tights was a big movie in our household, so were all of the Shirley Temple movies. So
I
really, you
love
know,
Shirley Temple.
yeah, no, and she was so cute. And I just knew when I grew up, I was going to be the next Shirley Temple. And, you know, it really just kind of grew from there. You know, I still love watching old movies, but now I dedicate most of my time to actually learning about the lives of the people who made the movies. And, you know, it was a pretty easy transition. I took a few years off from old Hollywood in general, in my, you know, like early-ish teen years, but by the time I was 18, 19, I was, you know, straight back into it.
Well, one of the things I love, you know, when we were doing the Goodnight Maryland radio show and as an investigator, you and Gary, we would, you know, all of the panel guests were really, I mean, you guys, Mary Jane and Leslie and stuff is and Gary Vitaka Robles, but, you know, especially with the details. That's what I love about your work, Gary's work as well, is that you guys get into the details. It's so easy in this bite-sized, you know, kind of bite-sized media that we're in is just to get these glimpses and you go, oh, she's just such a ditzy blonde, or she's this, you know, oh, she doesn't care about anything, or she slept her way to the top. Now we hear that a lot about Marilyn. How did Jean Harlow and Jayne Mansfield deal with that? You know, those kind of stigmas.
So Jean Harlow actually came from money. So and she had married, her first husband was wealthy. So she had been able to kind of navigate that a little bit better, I would say. You know, she knew that she would always have something to fall back on when she was first starting out. You know, if it didn't work out, you know, or someone was super lecherous, she could just easily be like, hey, I'm going back. You know, I don't need to put up with this. And then of course as her career progressed, and I'm not in any way saying that women didn't continue to deal with horrible situations after they became famous, but as her career progressed, it became a little bit less, and she, you know, was known very fondly as the baby at the studio, you know, and it was kind of like an off limits thing. As far as Jayne was very, very astute. She went out on dates with men who could help her career. I would say it's pretty close to, you know, how Marilyn was with stuff. She would go out on dates. Whether stuff happened, I mean, that's up for debate. But for the most part, Jayne was a serial monogamous. We know that, you know, after her husband Paul left, she dated Steve Cochran for a little bit, and then she dated Nicholas Ray. And these were all, you know, really powerful men during the time, but she also had feelings for them and was in love with them. So, you know, she was more of like, let's get involved in a relationship, but you can also help my career.
And also, you know, unlike Marilyn, had 5 kids. I mean,
Yes.
she had children, right? I mean, that was, you know, one of Marilyn's, you know, most cherished desires, you know, for her. And, you know, do you know how she reconciled those two? Because I think that, you know, I know Veronica Lake and some of the other, you know, kind of golden age blondes of that era, you know, it wasn't as easy to go from, oh, I'm going to be a mother, then I'm going to be a kind of a pinup classic Hollywood glamour girl, especially being a blonde one. How do you think they reconciled that, or do you know?
You know, I would say with they all handle motherhood very, very differently. I think that's the easiest way to put it. Veronica Lake, as you know, she has a bit of a mental breakdown and she just kind of leaves her kids, and that relationship is difficult for the rest of their lives. Betty Grable was a very, very strict mother. You know, her kids couldn't learn instruments because she was afraid they would become like her husband, Harry James. Even though she loved Harry, she didn't want that life for her daughters. You know, she was a very, very strict disciplinarian. There are things that happened back then that would in no way be acceptable today, and I am not excusing that, but you know, parenting in the early and late 40s or mid to late 40s, you know, and up really until the 60s is very, very different than how we parent today.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean,
and
they'd probably be, yeah, I mean, probably be put away and, or at least be accused of, you know, a much more abusive behavior. Whereas back then, you know, you got out a belt or you had, you know, I remember the nuns in the Catholic, you know, religion would, you know, you know, hit your knuckles, right? I mean, that was known to be acceptable back then as well.
Exactly. And I mean, you know, it's kind of a hard thing to deal with because you want to, you know, think of this person as like, oh, you know, everything they did was great. I mean, let's be honest, all fans do that. They want to think their person was great at all times. But, you know, you just realize like that was the parenting, you know, standard of the time, even though it was horrible. And I'm, you know, obviously I don't do that to my own child. And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
Jayne was actually a pretty strict parent. There's allegations later, you know, we don't have to go quite into that, but when she's, you know, at the top of her career, she has Jane Marie, she has Miklo, she has Zoltan. She's very, very strict, but she, you know, loves her kids, and all throughout her career until the very end, she is taking her kids with her everywhere. She wants to be around her kids. Her world is her kids. But, you know, and I hate to say it like this, but slightly above her kids is her career. And I think that's how it was for a lot of, you know, both dads, moms and dads. When you know, start looking at old Hollywood stuff, you know, the career is always the priority. You know, it doesn't mean that they weren't a good parent, doesn't mean they didn't try to spend time with their kids, but of course they want to keep working. And, you know, that's what I would classify pretty much all of the moms, you know, from this era as they want to keep working, they love their kids, but you know, they have to work to put food on the table.
And you know, that whole era in terms of the, you know, kind of, I was thinking about the pinup era. I wouldn't really like, delve into it as much. And then I realized, you know, where it was birthed out of. You know, you think about war, right? You know, First World War, you know, one. What was the calendar girl kind of at the turn of the century, and then, you know, by the Roaring 20s, then all of a sudden you have this birth of, you were talking about Jean Harlow, but then we had World War II. Do you think if we would have had World War II and World War One, World War II, we would have had this kind of progression of the sex symbol? I mean, given the fact that men were away at war, and then all of a sudden there was this pinup calendar and pinup posters, and you know, the birth of Playboy, right? All this stuff is starting to happen in the, you know, 40s and 50s.
Yeah, so like you said, in turn of the century, we have like the Gibson girl, you know, it's very, very popular. Pinups are popular, you know, even back, and they're popular before that too, but just in the 20th century. And then you're right. I mean, we progressed to the war pinups. That's a really great question. As you know, I teach a film class, and I was just discussing this with my students on Thursday. I think that we would have probably not had quite as much emphasis on sex symbols in the 50s without World War II. I think that Betty would have still been popular, Rita Hayworth would have still been popular, Veronica Lake would have still been popular because they're pretty much a natural, you know, a natural like evolution from the 1930s. But the 1950s is really a decade itself. It's about abundance. It's about, you know, obviously fertility. You know, we're right in the middle of the baby boom. And I think that is what really helped propel stars like Marilyn, Jayne, and Mamie Van Doren in the 1950s, was because we look at them as like, these are these, you know, fertile love goddesses, and I'm not reducing them to that, but it's just they're a completely different build than what we see in the 1940s with these super, you know, fit dancer types. I mean, that's what's really popular in the 40s, these strong women that you could definitely see being Rosie the Riveter. And the 1950s, it's much softer, it's much more voluptuous.
Well, and I was reading about Betty Grable, right? When How to Marry a Millionaire. She thought for sure she was going to get the role of Lorelai, which actually went to Marilyn Monroe. And I think it was on your blog that I actually even read this, was talking about how Marilyn was much more curvier, where she was more of a gymnast, that strong athletic body, right? So it's really interesting how that time has changed. What do you think? And I'm going to go through each one. What do you think is a misinterpretation or misconception about Betty Grable? Let's look at Betty Grable first.
Oh goodness, there's a lot. For starters, I know when she took
Give
the
me
white
three. Give me three.
Three. Okay. When she took the white swimsuit photos, she wasn't pregnant. There is a whole set of those photos. She is very, very flat. She actually took those photos when she was dating George Raft, because if you look on her right ankle, she has the ankle bracelet he had given her. It was right before she started dating Harry James, and she would become pregnant a few months later with her first child. Another thing I commonly see about Betty is the quote that she supposedly said to Marilyn, like, I've had mine, go get yours. That quote, for my research, and if someone has found it before this, I will, obviously change it. But for my research, I've never found where she said. I did find where she said it to Dan Daly in the late 1940s, but I've never found where she said to Marilyn. The first instance I can find of it being reported that she said to Marilyn is actually in 1957 in Walter Winchell's column, which would have been, 4 years after the fact. So that one I would say is dubious. Wouldn't rule it out completely, because it might have been a phrase that Betty used a lot, but we do know that she said it, at least 6 years earlier to Dan Daly. And as you know, a lot of this stuff crosses over.
Well, and I have to point out something for the people that are watching and are getting to know you more as a classic Hollywood expert. And I just want to affirm this, is that a lot of times people write books, they write articles, and they don't look at the details. And what you just said to me is really key, because even in today's society, somebody says one thing and then we take it as fact. Mm-hmm. And you and I both know, we've been down that rabbit hole, and how easy that is to do. And people start thinking it's been said enough, even a few times, and we just take it as fact. So that's really powerful. How about Veronica Lake?
Veronica Lake, good one. Veronica Lake. There's a lot of people who say that she was a diagnosed schizophrenic. There's no evidence to support that. She probably did have some sort of mental health issues, but and I am not diagnosing the dead, because you really can't do that. But a lot of professionals theorize that she was probably actually bipolar and not schizophrenic. But that's a big one, that she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and she was, like in the poorhouse basically. And that's not true. I mean, she steadily worked. She was able to, afford a decent apartment after she left films, even though she's working as a cocktail waitress.
Well, wait a minute here, because when I read that, I was like, I can't tell you how many times I've gone back to a classic Hollywood actress or actor, and they're at the height. I mean, look at Peter Lawford back in the day, right? I mean, here he is, the West Coast White House, married to one of the most powerful most powerful family of that time. And, he too had not going to say a tragic end. She obviously didn't, end her life there, but how many creative people actually have a mental disorder of some kind because they're so highly creative and actually really smart. And then what we find is that they self-medicate themselves. And, she was also an alcoholic too, which was not also very, did she die of cirrhosis of the liver? I'm not sure. Did she? Yeah, she died of Veronica Lake. And, when you see LA Confidential, that just takes from that whole time. And I mean, she perfected that whole, kind of curl look, that very sultry look. How about we'll go Jayne Mansfield? What's the biggest misconception of her?
The biggest misconception, without a doubt, is that Jayne was a Satanist. I see that everywhere.
Really?
Yeah. So there's a lot to this rumor. So we're going to do the Cliff Notes
Ooh,
version.
okay. See, I
Jayne
didn't,
and
see, I don't know that much about Jayne, so this is good. And I don't the classic, well, maybe they do. People that are into Jayne might know this. So
yeah, no. So Jayne met Anton LaVey very, very briefly for a few hours to meet his pet lion in October of 1966 when she was in San Francisco. And then that's it. There's just, that meeting for 1966. And 1967 comes along. Of course, the press at this point has heard about the meeting. Jayne is actually touring Vietnam for the soldiers, and she's going in other parts of Asia as well. She goes in Japan for a little bit. She's going all over. And he comes out and he goes, oh, she's joined my church. And Jayne was absolutely livid when he says this. And she actually sends a comment back, which for the time was like a huge expense, but she wants to get it out there. And she goes, I've met him. He's intelligent. I respect his ideas, but I will always be a proud Catholic. Jayne actually wasn't Catholic, but she identified as Catholic.
she was raised or had Catholic roots. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, got it.
No, it's more so that so she actually has like Methodist roots, but she falls in love with the Catholic Church, but she can't join because she's a divorcee. And so she's, sitting there and she's just like, she identifies as a Catholic. And then in May, she announces that she's converting to Judaism because she wants to marry her boyfriend at the time, Sam Brody, who would end up dying in the car accident with her. And in June, she's, sitting there, and Walter Fincher comes. He's a journalist and he's also a photographer. And he sets up a publicity stunt with Anton and Jayne. And Anton actually comes to the house and he takes photos with Jayne. And the whole thing is, they're going to run this. They're both going to get publicity. And because of those photos and Anton's comments, people are convinced she was a Satanist, but she wasn't a Satanist. She was actually a pretty deeply religious person, which you don't think of when you think of Jayne Mansfield. But she always, went to church throughout her entire life. And
what was her children then? What were they raised as? Because you've got Methodist, you've got Catholic, you've got Jewish, and then you got somebody accusing, the media accusing her of being a Satanist.
Yeah, no, her children, they usually went to the Episcopalian church. But I would say today that we would probably say that they're just like Christian, that they're not really with an affiliated church, because she was, keen on taking her children to explore different churches because that's how she had been raised, was to explore different churches.
And she's got a very famous daughter, Mariska, Harda, is it, how do you pronounce her last name?
Hargitay.
Hargitay, I should say that right. I was going to say Hardigay, and I was like, no, that's not it. Hargitay. And she's very famous. She's been on, television for years with the SVU, right?
Mm-hmm.
The NBC. Is it on NBC? I'm trying to think. It's been a long time. And it's still on, right?
It is still on. Yeah. I think they're on their 22nd season. So long.
It's really, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, she's an executive producer of the show. She's one of the highest paid women in television. She has been for years.
Well, and Mariska, in studying her acting, first of all, you can see her mother in her, which you know what I mean? Because you see that Jayne blonde hair and you see a lot of her mother in her, but she's also a really good actress. How would you describe Jayne's acting?
Jayne was talented. Jayne was very, very talented, but Jayne was limited. She had her range that she could do. She was really great in the dumb blonde comedies, and she was really actually quite good in dramas, but she never really explored it as much. So it's just kind of her range. But her dramas, I would say, are the best when she's able to kind of use her sexuality as part of the role versus, watching her like Betty Davis in a drama. I mean, it's completely different.
To describe, in looking at some of the things that describe her, she seems very much, this is where I would see Marilyn and her being very similar. People perceive, because they play that dumb blonde so well, that they're really dumb. But the things that I've read about her, she doesn't seem like a dumb person at all.
Yeah, no, Jayne spoke 5 languages. Now, I just want to say that the fluency on all 5 is debatable, but she could at least have
Like a religion, here we are talking about
Yeah.
religion.
But she was at least conversational in, other in 5 languages. And of course, she's fluent in English. But she also could play the viola, the violin, and the piano, although she really enjoyed playing the violin and the piano the most. And she was very proud of her 163 IQ. Again, I'm not going to say that it would be 163 using today's standards, but she was extremely intelligent.
Well, it speaks to Marilyn's intelligence as well, that most people don't realize that about her. And that's one of the most biggest, misconceptions. I want to share with you a quote I saw from her. It says, "I don't want to get involved in a racial situation, but I know that God created us equal and we're not living up to that." And that caught my eye because it's really interesting how sometimes things go full circle. Back then, it was a very different situation in terms of racial tensions, but here she was not really getting involved with racial stuff, but also making a point that we're all equal, even back at that time when the black and whites and the segregation was certainly going on. For her to make a statement like that, like Marilyn. So did she have the ability to stand up to certain things like Marilyn did? Because Marilyn would just be her own bird.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that Marilyn, I wouldn't say that Jayne was very active in politics at all. We do know that she was a Democrat. She supported Adlai Stevenson. When she, a little bit later, we don't really know her political affiliation, but at least in the mid 1950s and late 1950s, she did register as a Democrat. She supported Democrat candidates. But she quickly learned that politics were something, even, and it's just like today, people would get very, very mad if you spoke out about something that, they did not agree with. So she kind of would circle around issues, but for her to speak out against it means it was something that meant a lot to her, even if she, wasn't on the front lines. And I realized that, we could have a whole conversation about allyship, and I wouldn't classify her as like the best person from the time when it comes to, stuff like that. But I would say that, it was something that she felt strongly enough to talk about. And for her to talk about anything political, even if it was, kind of vague, was a big step for Jayne, because she really didn't talk about things like this. And I can count the amount of times she got political publicly about something on one hand.
Yeah, and it was really interesting, that comment too is putting her in a neutrality, but she's saying it without saying it. It's kind of a back door, she's not taking a stand. She's basically saying, hey, God created us all, but we're not living all equal, but we're not living up to it, which I thought was really interesting, given if you have a perception that she's ditzy and here she is, she's not. Let's move to Marilyn. You and I both know a lot about the misconceptions of Marilyn. What would you say are the biggest misconceptions about Marilyn Monroe?
I don't want to go too much into her death, so we'll just say we'll take that off the table, because we have a whole thing that people can listen to if they want to hear about her death.
Yes. Goodnight Marilyn Radio.
Yes. So I don't want to go into that. I would say the Ella Fitzgerald story, that's a big one. I would say, I'm trying to think of a few. Six Toes, I still see that
so
a lot.
let's talk about the Ella Fitzgerald story, because there's a lot of people in this classic Hollywood community that are maybe know the outs, kind of the just the the general details of that story. What is the truth behind that story? Because I think that would be a really
Yeah, so the Ella story actually comes from Ella, but I just want to remind people that she's recalling it 20 years later, and everything that happened in like a 3-month period. So it's very easy to get those, memories conflated. Ella remembered that Marilyn called the Macombo and she sat in the front row every night. Marilyn was not at the Macombo opening. We have Ella Fitzgerald's spread from Jet Magazine. Marilyn is not in it. Marilyn is well documented as being in New York in March of 1955 when Ella premiered at the Macombo. But what Marilyn did do was she went to the Tiffany Club, and she went multiple times. So it's most likely that when Ella was playing at the Tiffany Club, that Marilyn said, I will sit in the front row every night for you at the Tiffany Club. And then we do know that she called the Macombo and said, you need to book, Ella Fitzgerald. They booked her, and Marilyn had offered to throw Ella actually a party after her performance. But what ended up happening was Marilyn moved to New York, so she could never throw the party. And if people go to my website, they can see the telegram that was sent saying, by Marilyn's secretary that just says, I don't think you're going to be able to throw the party. I told Ella's people that you're not going to be able to throw the party, blah, blah, blah. So Marilyn actually helped Ella twice. People get so defensive about this story. And I'm like, no, the real story is better. She actually helped Ella twice at 2 different places.
And I think that's an update from our time a few years ago. So I love this. So let's also mention your website, because you just said it's on my website. It's classicblondes.com, right? That's where you can find that. And I find that very fascinating, because I can't tell you how many times I probably even said, I say now I just say nightclub, because I get so many mixed changes or mixed, like that was in the Macombo, but the fact that it could have been the Tiffany Club and not the Macombo, but she called the Macombo. See, these are the kind of details that over 50, 60, 70 years really get lost, and we start making up our stories that fit us as a culture. Don't you agree with that, April?
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, the Ella story comes from Miss Magazine. It's 20 years after the fact. I don't know about you, but I know with me, I can't tell you what I was doing 20 years ago. And if I tell my mom about something, she's like, oh no, you have that conflated, and it's just, that's how it is, and it's like, we have pictures of Marilyn at the Tiffany Club, and we have news clippings showing that she went to the Tiffany Club multiple times. So it's like, the better story is actually much better. But I completely agree with you. I think as a society, we get really stuck on these things. And a lot of times the real story is, much more interesting.
And so the 6 toes is the other misconception. Yeah, that she had 6 toes. So what's the third one, if you have another misconception about Marilyn?
Goodness, there's a lot. I know another one is that Marilyn took an IQ test and she got 165. Marilyn never took an IQ test. We don't know what Marilyn's IQ was. I've always thought that being it's 2 points above Jayne's, it was probably like some diehard Marilyn fan who was like, oh, Marilyn was smarter than Jayne, so she gave her 2 points higher. But saying the only reason Jayne got an IQ test is because she got in college, and that was like a big thing in the early 50s. Oh, come take an IQ test, and Marilyn was kind of past that because Marilyn's 7 years older than Jayne.
Well, and you think about it, but given what Marilyn was reading and her ability to even manufacture the symbol, that sex symbol, most people think that was her. And I was just watching a old interview of, is it Betty Roan, who is her last secretary, her personal assistant? Betty, does that sound familiar? She worked for Marilyn the last 8 months. Personal assistant.
Goodness, probably. I'm thinking of May Rees, but no.
Yeah, there was, and I had not, I was going to ask you, because I had, Gary hasn't mentioned her, but it was on a YouTube interview, and it was really interesting what she was talking about, is how bright she was in the terms of how she was reading all the time. And that, those misconceptions, again, I know you have experienced it. I certainly have. I've had people come up to me and go, you can't tell me that this didn't happen to Marilyn. They get very upset, when they think that something is true. But I want to just say this again, with this classic Hollywood, era, or anybody, is, go back and check your facts. That's why I love having people like you on the show like this, because we're bringing the past present. But the only way that we could really do that and do that well is to go back and kind of clean up the past a little bit, and be able to put the periods on the end of the sentence that we know the best. So in this classic Hollywood era and the classic blondes, let's go to nowadays. Here we are, present day.
Mm-hmm.
Who are some of the Hollywood stars that you think resemble that classic Hollywood glamour actress?
I think that there are people that would fit in the 50s, and that's probably the way rather go about it, because it's such a different, you know, vibe that we have now. But I would say Scarlett Johansson would definitely fit in with the 50s. She would have been popular in the 50s. I would also say that Amanda Seyfried probably would have been popular too. She's someone who you could play around with her look a lot. You know, she's just great. She would have been great. And I would also say, honestly, I think Meryl Streep just transcends generations. She's a little bit, you know, she's a little bit out of the age range that we're kind of talking about, but I just think she transcends generations. Just she would be a great dramatic actress from the time. And but as far as like people today, I know a lot of people make the Kardashian connection. I wouldn't say that the Kardashians would have been accepted in the 1950s, and I'm going to be completely honest, it's because of, you know, racial issues that the studio system had on stuff. So totally, you know, we'll just say that, you know, that's what it was. But that kind of wouldn't have worked. I know a lot of people think that Jayne was like the Kardashians, and in certain aspects she was, but in other aspects she's completely different. So, you know, it's kind of it's an iffy thing to go about.
Yeah. How about Angelina Jolie? She's not a blonde though. How about her?
You know, I think Angelina Jolie is another person who definitely would have trans. The only thing with Angelina Jolie, she kind of went for shock value a lot in her early part of, you know, her life. So I don't know, like, what she would have done in the 50s. I'd like to imagine that she probably would have done stuff kind of like what Jayne did. But I think I'd put Angelina Jolie probably a little more in the 60s. I think the 60s would have totally been Angelina Jolie's decade.
And how about Emma Stone? She's kind of got that kind of, but she's more redhead, not really blonde. Yeah. So
yeah, she Emma Stone is very, very popular. I actually like some of Emma Stone's work. I could see Emma Stone definitely making it, you know, probably more so really for Emma Stone, I would say the 40s. Like I could see her in the 30s or 40s.
you know, I'm sitting there thinking about, you know, you got the Billie Holiday documentary coming out, you know, had Judy Garland movie. I mean, there's a definite resurgence and kind of a retro feel of young people nowadays looking back and bringing some of these stars to life. Who is your favorite classic blonde
It depends
actress?
on the day. I probably do the most on Betty right now, but I really love Jayne a lot. I have to say, I really love Jayne. I would say if I could only watch one of their filmographies for the rest of my life, it would definitely be Betty. But if I was going to go back in time and be friends with them, I would be friends with Jayne.
Oh my God. Now, why Jayne? That's interesting. I thought you were going to say Marilyn.
No, because with Jayne, it's just like you know, she would go out, she'd have fun, she, you know, wanted to hang out, she just wanted to make people happy. She was, you know, just a really happy person for a lot of her life. I mean, you get to the later years and it's not quite the case, but you know, peak career, she was just living her life, she was enjoying it. She's 23 years old, which I wish I could be 23 again. And you know, she's just having a ball of the time, and I would just love that. As much as I love Marilyn, I would have a very hard time with the late night phone calls. I know myself. I'm not a very patient person, which I'm sure my son would completely agree with that. And Betty was such a workhorse that I don't think you could really have time with her unless you wanted to go to the racetrack. So it would have to be Jayne.
Jayne's your girl. And if you were to describe these three women in one word, what would you say? Betty, what would be her word that you would describe?
Workaholic.
Jayne.
Also workaholic.
Marilyn.
Sensitive.
Sensitive. Well, on that note, you know, it's really interesting because Betty Grable and Veronica, they both died in the same year in the same week. I was sitting there looking at their, you know, and they both, all these people like Jayne Mansfield, you know, 34 years old, Marilyn, 36, Jean Harlow, you know, here she was she 26 when she passed, right? Very, very young, you know? So, you know, I just, I find talking about all these old Hollywood actors and actresses so fascinating. I'm so excited that not only do you get to bring them to life here, on these platforms like social media and podcasts and radio, but that you're teaching this in school and college. So I think that's really, really powerful in terms of film history. And I just want to thank you so much for being on today's show on the Best Classics Ever, that is featured both on Best Classics Ever as well as the Classic Movie Hub. And get the word out there about your books. But I have to say it right. Puff, but how do you say it one more time for me?
Pufflicity.
Publicity, yes.
Yes.
But that's already out. But then you have part 2, which is going to be the coffee table book. And then you have the day in the life of Marilyn Monroe, which is really detailed. Is it her last year, right, of her life? Is that right?
It's her whole life. It's a timeline of her whole life. I'm just going to put a disclaimer right now that it is for somebody who wants to go, what was Marilyn doing on this date? It's not structured like a typical biography. It's just a complete timeline of her life.
Well, I just remember from the Goodnight Marilyn radio show calling up you or Gary and going, okay, what was Marilyn doing on a Tuesday on March 2nd? And you guys would come back, well, she wasn't in New York. She was in Beverly Hills at a conference. And I'm like, how do you guys know all of this? It's, we wouldn't be able to bring the past present without people like you, April. So I just want to say how much I appreciate you. Go to classicblondes.com, check out her blog, check out her books, the new books coming out this year. Thank you so much for being on the show today and talking about our classic blondes here on Best Classics Ever.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Nina. I had a really great time.
All right. So until next time, we'll leave it with a Marilyn thought. She would say, hold a good thought. And we'll hold a good thought for all the classic Hollywood movie fans and TV shows and Westerns here on Best Classics Ever. And make sure you check out, oh my gosh, I have to just say this, one more thing. What's your favorite Betty Grable film?
Oh, definitely Sweet Rosie O'Grady.
Okay, Jayne Mansfield.
The Girl Can't Help It.
All right, and Marilyn Monroe.
Gentlemen Prefer Blondes.
All right, on that note, we are bringing the past present. I'm Nina Boski, and until next time, we'll see you again. Have a good night.